Welcome to Healing Talk Radio. This is your host, Diana Hoffman. I'm here every Friday at noon to explore the best in research and resources for healing our minds, our bodies, and our relationships. Healing Talk Radio is broadcast live on KHQN 1480 AM in Utah and is simulcast globally on internet television on UtahValleyLive.com. Replays of this program play daily for a week on Planetary Streams Talk Radio, Web Campus Worldwide Radio, and Shoutcast. And programs are archived at healingtalkradio.com. The focus of our program today is going to be trauma, the root of addictions. Now, addictions are a huge concern in our country. They have been for many, many years. And there's been a great deal of speculation about what causes addictions. And there have been a great many programs designed at trying to reduce addiction problems in our country. But what we're beginning to see is that the fundamental premise of a lot of these efforts may have been misdirected. A lot of groups and individuals have assumed that addiction is a disease, or addiction is genetic, or sometimes addiction is just an accident of adolescence. It's the result of teenage curiosity and recklessness and peer pressure. And the truth is that none of these paradigms are the main cause. They do cause some addiction, every one of them, but none of them are the main cause. And so a lot of our programs that are directed towards educating young people on the dangers of drugs and trying to educate the public about addiction are not as effective as we'd like them to be because they're missing the core problem. And what's the core problem? The core problem with trauma, the core problem with addictions appears to be trauma. And when I say appears to be, there's really solid evidence that trauma is the root of addictions. The best evidence that we have comes from the ACE studies. Now, we talked about the ACE studies last week in terms of trauma and physical health. And the correlations between the ACE studies and health problems are very intense, but they're not near as dramatic as the correlations between trauma and addiction. In fact, the statistical outcomes on trauma and addiction are just staggering. For example, if we look at these outcomes from the ACE studies, the chances of a person developing alcoholism and not being able to stop in their life as an adult increase 640% if the person has 4 or more categories of trauma in their childhood. The chances of using illegal injected drugs increases 930% for a person with 4 or more traumas. The chances of getting addicted to smoking increases 180% for a person with 5 or more traumas. The chances of food addictions, obesity-related, increases 60% for a person with 4 or more traumas. And that's just for, most of these are for 4 or more traumas. If the number of traumas goes up, the number of addictions increases very dramatically. For example, for a person with 6 or more traumas, the chances of using injected illegal drugs goes up 4,000%, a 40-fold increase in injected illegal drug use if a person has 6 or more traumas. And so in every category where the ACE studies have studied the connection between trauma and addiction, there's this stepwise, consistent graded increase. A little bit of trauma results in a little more addiction. Add more trauma than that, you get even more addiction. More trauma than that, you get even more addiction. Very, very consistent graded relationship, which makes this statistically an extremely credible correlation. The ACE studies are very, very difficult to argue with. In fact, there isn't really any argument against them that logically holds water because the correlation between trauma and addiction is so high. And now we have to talk a little bit about what we mean by trauma. And the ACE studies don't study all categories of trauma. They just studied childhood trauma. And these were the events that were considered to be a category of childhood trauma according to the ACE studies. The first are the abuse categories: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and then neglect, emotional neglect and physical neglect, and then witnessing domestic violence, and then not having a biological parent in the home, meaning not both parents are gone, but if one of the biological parents are absent, This is considered a trauma category, whether that's a result of divorce or adoption or death of parent or parents. Any one of these categories, that's considered to be a trauma category by the ACE studies. And then the last three categories are addiction of any family member during childhood, criminal behavior as measured by a family member is incarcerated during childhood, or mental illness in a family member. And so this is what James Folletti and Dr. Andis, or Vincent Folletti and Dr. Andis, the creators of the ACE study, defined as childhood trauma. And these are the categories that intensely drive and elevate addiction rates more than anything else that's ever been studied. In fact, far more than anything else that's ever been studied, trauma results in addiction. And so if we look at a lot of our social programs, we're seeing that they're kind of missing what's really needed. For example, a lot of our programs about resolving drug problems are mostly about detoxification, getting the person off of the physical addiction, getting them cleaned up and dried out so that there's no more drugs in their body and so that their body has gone past those very difficult withdrawal stages that are so uncomfortable. If that was the main solution to addiction, if just getting a person through withdrawal was the main solution, then our addiction detox programs would be 90 or 100% successful. And the truth is they're really not. They're really not very successful at all. Detox isn't the answer. It's just one step. It's just one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the primary piece of the puzzle. The primary piece of the puzzle has to involve resolving the underlying trauma. And an often overlooked fact that Andis and Folletti like to bring up in their research is the fact that during the Vietnam War, a very large percentage of Vietnam veterans became addicted to heroin. They used heroin heavily in Vietnam. It was readily available. They came back to the States. They removed themselves from the trauma of battlefield combat, wartime, returned to their familiar environments. Within 10 months, 95% of those veterans were heroin-free. Only 5% remained addicted. And no treatment therapy accounts for that. Most of them were not in therapy for the heroin addiction, and the recovery rates for the heroin treatments being used were not nearly that successful. So what apparently happens is just removing these soldiers from the trauma situation enabled them to give up their heroin addiction. In other words, it wasn't primarily a physical addiction. It was primarily an emotional or a trauma-based addiction. Now, the difficulty we have in trauma addiction is that with early childhood traumas, these childhood traumas are recorded in very deep and kind of primitive parts of the brain. The brain has different sorts of systems for recording memory, but childhood memories are recorded at a very deep level, down in the brainstem and the limbic system, using a lot of what we call procedural memory, which is not the same as our conscious adult cerebral cortex memory. And these types of embedded childhood traumas don't really respond to just changing the environment. They remain active. They remain often suppressed, but they remain as an encoded part of a person's brain chemistry even after a child grows up, moves away from home, and gets into an environment where they're completely away from the traumatic factors or the traumatic events that they experienced. The trauma symptoms will not stop. And we see this statistically in the age of the participants of the ACE studies. The ACE studies were studying childhood trauma, so things that happened before the age of 10. The average age of the participants in the ACE studies was 50. So what we were seeing was addictive symptoms 40 years after the trauma events. 40 years after these things happened, at least 30 years after the person had left home and started a life of their own, the addiction still persisted as a function of these trauma events. And the ACE studies are really one of the most credible and one of the most heavily published pieces of research that we've had in the last century. There are to date 68 different articles and manuals that have been written based on the ACE studies, and a lot of them in very prominent medical journals, as we talked about last week, and very prominent psychological journals. And you can find the ACE studies posted on the Center for Disease Control website, the U.S. government website, which will list all 68 articles by topic and by date of publication. And these are all, you can find these all on my website. If you go to healingtalkradio.com, there's a link that will take you right to that page in the Center for Disease Control website. But so basically, this is not a piece of research that we can argue with. It's not in question. It's just substantially being ignored, partly because people don't really know what to do about it. What do you do about the fact that a huge amount of our population has childhood trauma? In fact, there were two different waves of the ACE studies, and they estimated the number of participants who had childhood trauma as 59% and 64% respectively. So between 59% and 64% of that segment of the population. Now remember that this is the segment of the population that's high functioning enough to have health insurance. So these are people who are working. These are functioning adults. These are people who made it to adulthood. By the time the ACE studies happened, with these participants' average age of 50, although there were people of all ages, we must assume that the most severe addicts and the most severely traumatized people had dropped out of the study as a function of suicide or death from drug addiction or becoming homeless, non-functioning people because of addiction or being locked up in jail. So the most traumatized segment of the population isn't even represented in the ACE studies. The ACE studies just shows us our average working middle-class adult. That's what the ACE studies studied. And so we have to assume that the rates of childhood trauma in our society are significantly higher even than the ACE studies suggest. And the ACE studies suggest at least 59% of us have this kind of trauma. That's a huge and a devastating number. And so it's helpful to kind of look at what can be done to fix this. We've occasionally heard metaphors about our treatment for addictions and trauma and family dysfunction as being like putting ambulances at the bottom of the cliff instead of putting guardrails up on the highways. And we really need a lot more guardrails. And the guardrails up on the highways, the things that prevent addiction at its very core, are things that would address repairing family dynamics on a national level. And so it's very likely that in the long term we could reduce our rates of addiction better by giving our young people really well thought out parenting classes in high school than by giving them drug prevention programs. Now, I think both are a good idea. I think we should do both. But it would be very, very helpful if we started teaching our young people in high school about how to do family communication, about how to do nurturing, about how to do attachment parenting, how to do bonding with their children at a level that would prevent the kind of attachment trauma that's producing these high levels of addiction. It would be a really good idea if our high schools presented students with a course in brain-based release therapies, how to let go of emotional pain. Our culture is amazingly deficient in the skill of emotional release. We're amazingly deficient in the ability to permanently and completely and continuously, meaning week to week, month to month, day to day, let go of our pain and trauma and move on and heal. We don't really know how to do this, and there are a lot of Eastern cultures that know how to do it a lot better. This is what our teenagers need to be taught. This is what our children need to be taught, both by their parents and by our culture and by the media. We need to be taught how to release trauma if we have any hope of reducing the devastating effects of addiction. And so, to some degree, we're really spending our money in the wrong place. And it's also really easy to see that the kind of the pervasive deterioration of the family in our country is seriously at the heart of our addiction problems. Repairing the family equals repair the addiction problems, because addictions are based on what? Attachment, bonding, childhood trauma in families that are dysfunctional. When I say that, I want to include a caveat. That does not mean that every person who's addicted has dysfunctional parents. There are traumas that can occur when parents are trying very hard and are very loving, and there are even attachment and bonding disasters that can happen with loving and caring parents. And I'd like to talk about that for just a minute, just so we know and we can avoid some of these inadvertent tragedies that happen just because of misinformation or just because of poor traditions. I remember being in a college psychology class and hearing the professor relate a story. And this was kind of at the beginning of the attachment movement, when people were just starting to understand attachment theory and bonding and what happened when attachment was destroyed. And so attachment basically means that a child feels their parent is the source of safety. A child feels close enough to their parent that when they're hurt or distressed, they will run to their parent for comfort, and they will feel comforted by that parent. The parent is the source of safety, the source of peace, the source of stress regulation for an infant and a small child. And so attachment or bonding trauma happens when the parent becomes the source of fear instead of the source of safety. Now, this can happen several ways. The most obvious way is when the parent is abusive or has anger management problems and says, well, I just can't help myself, or parenting is so difficult, or my children are so unreasonable, that they blow up and become frightening to the child. But it can also happen if the parent has a great deal of anxiety. The parent is always worrying, the parent is always fearful. Being around the parent makes the child fearful. This creates a situation where the parent is the source of fear instead of the source of safety, and that damages attachment. What we more often see is a situation where the parent simply has very rigid beliefs about parenting. And so in this psychology class when I was in college, the professor told a story about a couple who brought in their child at the age of 10, and he was just a terror. He was violent, he was aggressive, he was defiant, he was being kicked out of schools repeatedly, he was very unmanageable. He was already doing criminal behavior at the age of 10 and just raging at his parents. And as the psychologist worked with him, he found that this was the child's history. When the child was an infant, the parents had strongly believed that you have to get your child on a schedule. You have to just feed them every 4 hours. And so this baby would just not eat well. It would just eat a little tiny bit and then it would stop. And then a half hour later it was crying and fussing and wanting to be fed. And following the advice of so many relatives and community members, the parents wouldn't feed the baby. They'd make it wait and wait and wait. And the baby would fuss and fuss and cry and cry and cry the whole 3 hours. And then they'd feed it and it would only eat just a little bit. And this went on for months, and finally some very frustrated relatives and parents convinced the couple to start punishing the baby every time it tried, so they would spank it when it cried. And after 6 or 8 months, the baby was very, very malnourished. They took it into the doctor and discovered that the baby had an extremely underdeveloped stomach, had a very tiny stomach. It could only eat a little bit of food. It couldn't eat more. But by this time, the parents had destroyed their attachment and bonding with this child. And as much as they were well-intentioned, as much as they tried, they were not able to repair that attachment. And so this child grew up to be a very angry, difficult child and a very violent, aggressive teenager. And that's the risk that we run in rigid parenting, which unfortunately is not only common in our culture, it's traditional. It was the main approach to parenting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But recently we have had a resurgence in very rigid parenting with just a disastrous book that's been published called Baby Wise. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, about attachment, and a lot more about addictions. We're going to break right now for a commercial, but we'll be right back. You're listening to Healing Talk Radio.
You've heard ads to send your old jewelry off to a refiner. Stop! Here's a better idea. Take your old jewelry and diamonds to the Jeweler's Bench. We are conveniently located in downtown Provo at 275 North University Avenue. I'm Daniel Broadbent, owner of the Jeweler's Bench. We are experienced in selling and buying fine jewelry. We give you an honest evaluation of what your pieces are worth, then give you several options. The Jeweler's Bench can buy your jewelry for cash now, or sell it for you on consignment, or even repair it or make it into something new. We buy antique jewelry, broken, worn-out jewelry, new jewelry, coins, or any other kind of precious metal. We will evaluate and give you the best value for your diamonds. Gold is high. Now is the time to sell. You need to convert that valuable stuff that you are not using into something that you can use right now. Come to the Jeweler's Bench for an immediate free evaluation. We are open Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. at 275 North University Avenue, downtown Provo. We'd love to help you soon. Ads.
Hi, this is Julia Curry. Join me on KHQN 1480 AM on Mondays from noon to 1 o'clock. Exciting things are happening in Utah Valley, and there's much to talk about. I'll have a variety of guests each week discussing current issues, entertainment, and events specific to Utah Valley. So tune in and tell your friends. You never know who will be sharing the microphone with me, but I guarantee we're gonna have a good time. That's the Julia Curry Show, Monday, noon to 1 o'clock, right here on KHQN 1480 AM.
Hi, I'm Roger Strong. I'm here to tell you about Tidbits of Utah County. No death, divorce, devastation, or destruction, just good news for good people. You'll find us everywhere in Utah Valley, in doctors' offices, restaurants, mechanic shops, anywhere that people wait. We have over 35 features of fun, family-friendly entertainment. To find a paper or to advertise, call Roger at 801-616-6288. Again, that's Roger at 801-616-6288. We're Tidbits of Utah County, the happy paper for Happy Valley.
Are you looking to create another revenue stream in 2012? Are you willing to put out the effort, generate some cash flow? Pat Sheranian is seeking 10 motivated individuals to join her Kyani team as independent distributors. Earn as much as you are willing to work for selling Kyani Sunrise, Sunset, Nitro FX, and Nitro Extreme. These great products are helping thousands of people enjoy better health and an improved financial situation. The most successful Kyani independent distributors started by trying the Kyani products, just as you can, virtually risk-free, as Kyani offers a 30-day money-back satisfaction guarantee. Try them and don't like them, and you'll get your money back, less the shipping costs. So many people today are challenged by obesity and diabetes, or don't have enough money for their needs, and they aren't doing anything about it. Don't be one of them. Call Pat Sheranian at 801-362-9552 to find out more about Kyani and what it can do for your health and for your wealth. That's 801-362-9552.
Welcome back to Healing Talk Radio. This is your host, Diana Hoffman, and we're talking about trauma and the root of addictions, how addictions are basically caused by early childhood trauma, especially attachment and bonding trauma. If we look at the categories of the ACE studies, they encompass a lot of things that we could consider to be event trauma, but they much more persistently describe what we call attachment and bonding trauma, which is a child's attachment to their parents. And that kind of trauma is by far the hardest kind of trauma to repair in therapy. Event trauma, with the kind of tools we have now, like rapid brain-based dynamic trauma releases, event trauma is easy to fix, even if it's very severe trauma. We're talking like rape, war crimes, loss of family members, service as a veteran in the military. All these kinds of event traumas can be absolutely devastating, but they are relatively easy to fix. But attachment trauma is not easy to fix. No matter what kind of therapy is used or how skilled the therapist is, attachment trauma is very difficult and usually takes years. And if there's severe attachment trauma, we're going to get severe personality disorders or severe reactive attachment disorder, just very, very dysfunctional adult lives and severe addiction, which is what we're talking about. And I mentioned before the break that we've had a resurgence of what we would consider attachment disaster parenting with the publication of a book called Baby Wise. And Baby Wise was not written by a therapist, it was not written by a researcher, it was not written by anybody qualified in the study of human development or behavior. It was written by a minister named Gary Ezzo. He used to be a minister. He's not a minister anymore. His congregation dismissed him, and he was excommunicated because of what was happening as the result of writing this book. Nevertheless, this is a very popular book, and it is being very widely embraced by the current generation of parents who think it's just a wonderful idea to train your baby to be on a schedule and to only eat every 3 hours when food is presented. But what we're actually seeing as a result of this is a lot of babies being hospitalized with dehydration or malnutrition. And the reason for this is because parents who strictly follow Gary Ezzo's plan, They offer the baby food or a chance to nurse. If the baby doesn't eat, then the parent's supposed to wait until the next feeding 3 hours later. If they do that, then the baby's gone 6 hours without being fed. And the baby has spent much of those last 3 hours crying the whole time until it's absolutely exhausted. And so the next feeding comes up and the baby's too tired. It eats just a little bit and then just falls asleep from sheer exhaustion because it's been crying for so many hours to be fed. And so then we're going out to 9 hours before the next opportunity to feed the baby. And by this time, we've got babies that are being physically compromised and ending up at the hospital. At some point, some very rigid parent who's very unwilling to take their baby to the hospital is going to end up with a death. They're going to have a baby die as a result of following BabyWise. And then we're going to have a lot more of a national focus on this catastrophic approach to parenting. Until then, what we're just going to have is a lot of attachment bonding traumas that is going to result in a lot of very difficult children, very rebellious teenagers, and very addicted adults. And so really strongly, I would encourage any young parents who are considering or reading BabyWise to go to articles by pediatric associations, articles by attachment parenting, articles by all of these groups that are research-based about parenting, and read their critiques of BabyWise, because they have just scathing criticism for this disaster of a book. And I submit that the only reason it's become so popular is because it's what people want to hear. Yeah, babies are hard. Just simplify your life. Just make them conform to your schedule. Make your baby eat exactly when you let it and no other time. And this is just not good parenting practice, as appealing as it sounds, because we have to acknowledge that virtually every new mother is sleep deprived, and that's a very difficult thing. Coming back to the problem of addiction, let's talk a little bit about exactly why childhood trauma leads to addiction, especially why bonding and attachment trauma leads to adult addiction. When a child is an infant, it does not have any resources to take care of its needs and to save itself from distressing situations. It relies completely on its parents, not only for warmth, shelter, food, comfort, but also relies on its parents for learning how to soothe and recover from stresses. Now, if the mother and the father are responsive, and if they cuddle and nurture and care for the baby whenever the baby is distressed, the baby develops brain structures that gradually grow into self-soothing structures. And so the baby is going to develop a larger amygdala and a larger hippocampus. And the baby is going to have more oxytocin receptors in its brain. It's going to have a lot of physical structures that enable the baby to, as it grows into a child, to calm itself down and to learn how to feel good on its own. And if the parents are particularly enlightened, so that when the child gets older, every time the child falls down and hurts itself or experiences something particularly devastating, if the parent holds the baby or the child and lets them cry and says, "It's okay, I'll just be right here with you until you're all done," then the child is going to learn natural emotional release skills, which is that process of experiencing the painful emotion, bringing it to the surface, linking it with calming and soothing sensations, and neutralizing the trauma. And this happens right at a cellular level. What we know now about trauma is that a fearful or a painful event activates brand new neurons in the hippocampus and imprints them with the emotion of that event. And these neurons are typically just 2 weeks old, just barely formed by the brain. They're newly imprinted. They're not connected to anything. After new neurons are imprinted with a traumatic event, one of two things will happen. Either immediately after that, the person will experience a safe situation, calming, soothing, reassurance, either generated by themselves or by a parent, and they will network that fear neuron to a great big network of calm and soothing sensations and experiences, or not, or they'll repress it. They won't visit it. They'll try to stuff it because they're not really safe to release it. If a person's not really safe to release it, they keep repressing these networks, then the next time that new neuron activated by trauma is set off, it will be triggered by other trauma experiences, and the new neuron will network to the old trauma experiences, and the trauma network will get bigger and bigger. The fear network, the anxiety network, the depression network will get bigger and bigger in the brain. For individuals who do not learn anything about safety and release at home, this network will continue to grow. And at some point, it will become overwhelming to the person's ability to feel good. And so most often in the mid-30s, but sometimes before and sometimes after, the person who's been functioning fairly well up to that point will suddenly find themselves just overwhelmed by depression or anxiety, or overwhelmed by anger. And they will find all these traumatic experiences and feelings and memories coming to the surface in a very unwanted and very overwhelming way. That doesn't have to happen. It wouldn't happen if we were all teaching our children how to network their pain to calm sensations as they were growing up, or if we were even learning as a function of our education in elementary or in high school or even in college how to network our trauma to soothing and peaceful sensations, then this wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have this big buildup, and that eventually results in kind of a breakdown in the mid-30s or the 40s. Now, sometimes we have teenagers who are so distressed in childhood, so overwhelmed that they're not going to make it that long. And so children who have a really distressing amount of childhood pain that's unresolved, they will start using alcohol and drugs as early as they possibly can to mask their pain. And we notice in our country that the age at which children become addicted is getting younger and younger and younger. It used to be 15, and then it was 13, and then 11, and now we're having 10 and 9-year-olds getting addicted to drugs and to alcohol. If they can possibly get their hands on them, they're not that hard to get. The reason is not that they're trying to impress their peers, it's that they're trying to mask their pain. Anybody who's worked with addicts, especially teenage addicts, is impacted by how much these young people are in pain, how much emotional trauma and distress they have. And so the psychoeducation programs that we see in high schools about drug and alcohol, they really don't address these young people at all, because these kids often are in so much pain, they don't care if they overdose. They don't care if they die. They just want to not feel the pain for a few minutes. They just want to feel better for a little bit of time, and drugs are the only way that they know how to get there. And so this is a very difficult problem, and it's not resolved by telling the kids that drugs are dangerous. We're going to talk a little bit more about the mechanisms of addiction and what they do to the brain. We're going to break right now for a commercial, and we'll be right back. You're listening to Healing Talk Radio.
Thanks for listening to our broadcast. Please do us a favor and take a moment to call, text, or email your friends and family and let them know about this show. We're live on this radio station, KHQN AM 1480, and on UtahValleyLive.com, where this show will be archived for later viewing. Also, Utah Valley Live is seeking additional programming for our growing network, talk shows about religion or politics, how-to shows, and more. Go to UtahValleyLive.com and send us your contact information and the type of show you would like to broadcast.
I'm Diana Hoffman. I'm a hypnotherapist. Hypnosis is not a procedure someone does to you. It's a skill that you learn. Hypnosis creates a bridge between the conscious and the subconscious mind. It's a way of translating your needs, your goals, and your wishes into deep brain language so that you can create your own lasting change. Hypnosis can help you to sleep better, lose weight, stop smoking, or let go of your anger. Or it can help you improve your performance, competing in the zone, running faster, playing with power, sharpening your focus. Hypnosis can remove barriers in your life, allowing you to eliminate anxieties, phobias, or physical pain. Or you may use it to enhance your inner focus, reaching that profound level of peace that allows your mind to tap into deep inner wisdom. Call me at 801-735-7814. That's 801-735-7814. I can help you access the most powerful parts of yourself.
Moving? LDSagents.com is a free nationwide service connecting you with over 3,000 real estate agents who understand questions about meeting house locations, ward boundaries, early morning seminary, and family neighborhoods. Buy, sell, or finance with an agent who understands you. LDSagents.com. Moving?
Hey, this is Jared Munn. Join me on my new show, Ground Rules, every Tuesday from 12 noon to 1, where we're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the funny of relationships. Join us as we discuss the games of dating, marriage, and just trying to figure out the opposite sex. So whether you've just started dating, or you're newlywed, or nearly dead, you've got questions, so let's get some answers. On the radio at KHQN 1480 AM and streaming live at UtahValleyLive.com.
Welcome back to Healing Talk Radio. This is your host, Diana Hoffman, and we're talking about trauma, the root of addictions. And as we talk about what happens to the brain when a person has a lot of childhood trauma, there's several self-healing mechanisms that cease to function effectively. One of the things that happens with neural networking in the brain is that the bringing of trauma networks to the surface, into the consciousness to be resolved and linked up with peaceful and safe networks, this is uncomfortable. And the bigger the trauma, the more uncomfortable it can be, unless a person really has a lot of safety and knows how to pace themselves very carefully, which addicts don't. People who have become addicted to drugs, especially in their adolescence, have not spent any time learning how to fix their own brain. They haven't learned the stress management skills that create positive neural networking. They've learned that every time old pain comes to the surface, they run for their drug of choice. And so they completely prevent the brain from healing itself. They completely interfere with this neural networking process that brings healing and peace. And there's a lot of very simple things that people learn to do that produce positive neural networking. For instance, exercise. Going for a walk can produce positive neural networking if a person is willing to let the pain come to the surface and then let it be connected to the scenery and the fresh air and the deep breathing and just the physical activity, the intense activation of the cerebellum that happens in walking. Because the cerebellum's all about balance and coordination, and it has 70 billion neurons in there, and that's really a lot of resources for neural networking. So this neural networking can happen just as a function of walking. It can happen as a function of doing a hobby that uses motor skills. But it happens even more effectively if a person learns a resource that activates slow or deep brainwave states. And so if people learn to just listen to quiet, relaxing music, or if they learn to meditate, or even if they like to read, or if they like to ponder, they're going to let themselves go into deep brainwave states. The particularly healing brainwave states are alpha, which is somewhere around 10 hertz, and theta, which is somewhere around 5 hertz. There's a range of a couple of hertz on either side of both of these. Alcoholics categorically, research have shown, have lost the ability to enter a normal natural alpha state. The alpha state of where most people are just peaceful and relaxed, where they can socialize, they can feel at ease, they can just be calm and daydreaming or pondering. Alcoholics have lost the natural alpha state, and this is so disconcerting to them, it's so challenging for them that they repeatedly use alcohol, a depressant, to create an artificial simulation of a natural alpha state. But in this artificial simulation created by alcohol, they do not experience the process of emotional release, the process of neural networking that's needed to resolve their trauma. So when the alcohol wears off, instead of feeling the relief that comes from emotional release, they just feel this sudden, burdensome reappearance of all of their pain and all of their stresses. And then their stresses get worse because of what alcohol does to their lives. And if we look deeper down the spectrum, people who get really good at repairing their brains learn to enter a theta wave state. Now, that's a state that people usually only learn if they're studying meditation, or if they're getting a really good massage, or if they're learning some self-hypnosis skills, or if they're deeply involved in prayer or worship. All of these things can create a deep theta wave state. And a theta wave state, which some people might describe as a trance state, but it can be many other things as well. A theta wave state at about 5 hertz produces so much endocannabinoids and endorphins that a person gets a very strong natural high. Well, the natural high is so potent that at this point, if emotional release happens, if neural networking happens, the person feels so euphoric that the pain is not distressing. And I've experienced this. I've been into these kinds of states, and I've had that experience of having deep, painful, repressed trauma come to the surface and discovering that I was so euphoric it was totally okay. I knew I was in pain, but I was also euphoric at the same time. It was great. It was the best thing I've ever seen for healing emotional pain. And drug addicts and alcoholics absolutely never do that. Whenever the pain starts to come to the surface, they run for their drug instead of letting the natural course of release happen, and instead of learning how to slow it down and pace it and work through it and be okay. You hear people who know how to naturally release say things like, "It was really, really awful, but I just went and had a good cry and then I felt better afterwards." The important part of that statement is not the good cry. Crying isn't actually necessary. It's, "I felt good afterwards." It's whatever they did to emotional release, they got to peace afterwards. So crying doesn't necessarily mean an emotional release was completed. An emotional release doesn't necessarily mean that crying happened. But if the pain comes up and then is resolved completely into a peaceful, healing state, that's a full emotional release. And that's what addicts cannot do, and that is what they must learn to do to recover from addiction, which is why programs that just dry them out, detox programs, don't address the full picture and are often not successful. Now, the difficulty with addicts is they're so used to their shortcut approach, their quick Band-Aid of a pill or a drink, that it's very hard for them to muster the discipline to learn self-healing skills. Addicts don't learn emotional release skills very easily or very, very willingly, and when their pain comes up, they have a hard time remembering to do that. They just want to rush for their substance of addiction. And so one of the most effective therapies that's ever been created for addiction is using neurofeedback, using brain imaging resources, actually brainwave resources, to teach an addict how to slow down the brainwaves and enter an alpha and a theta wave state. And the neurofeedback research is very credible and has been repeated multiple times and is very impactful. The very first really good piece of neurofeedback research we had was the Peniston and Kulkowski research that was published in the late 70s and early 80s. And Peniston and Kulkowski took a group of Vietnam veterans who'd been in and out of treatment over and over again and were addicted to alcohol. And they had post-traumatic stress disorder, so they had trauma and they had the addictions. They took this group of men and they divided the study group in half, and one half got all of the conventional therapies, which was group and individual therapy. The research group got that, but also got 20 sessions of alpha theta wave training using neurofeedback, meaning the researchers put little electrodes on their head and used a computer to record their brainwaves and rewarded them in some fashion every time they slowed their brainwaves down. That particular intervention was so successful that at the one-year follow-up, the group that got neurofeedback maintained 80% sobriety. The control group maintained only 20% sobriety. Only 1/4 as many were able to stay sober without the neurofeedback. Now, this is a very impactful piece of research, and it was published in some important journals, and so then it was repeated. It was repeated by other researchers with about the same results. Peniston and Kulkowski repeated it a couple of more times. Most recently, it was repeated in Los Angeles, California, in which the study group included addictions of all kinds, not just alcoholism. Again, the results were about the same. The control group did a little better. They maintained 40% sobriety at the follow-ups, 5 years, instead of 20. But the research group, the neurofeedback group, again was getting 75% sobriety and maintaining it at 1 year and at 3-year follow-ups. So very impactful. It's much, much easier to learn slow brainwave states and neural networking using neurofeedback than just trying to be disciplined. It's much easier to just train the subconscious, train the brain, not rely on the willpower or the conscious mind to take over. And so neurofeedback continues to be one of the most profound solutions for addictions that we have ever seen. Unfortunately, it's not very widely used. In fact, let me read this quote from a textbook called Clinical Addiction Psychiatry, published by David Breiser and Ricardo Castaneda at the Cambridge University Press last year, October 31st. Actually, the year before last, October 31st, 2010. So a very new textbook on addiction psychiatry. And it states this: EEG feedback, that means neurofeedback, with treatment-resistant veterans suffering from alcohol dependence and post-traumatic stress disorder. The neurofeedback was an adjunct to standard treatment at the time, individual and group psychotherapy. 10 subjects in the treatment group had good outcomes, while control subjects remained alcohol dependent. Small replication studies appeared in subsequent years, which supported the original findings. Peniston also followed up with additional confirming studies. One subsequent large-scale controlled study undertaken at a residential treatment center in Los Angeles replicated the previous Peniston findings. The neurofeedback intervention was applied to patients with substance dependencies other than alcohol. Participant outcomes did not depend on the drug of choice. It doesn't matter what kind of addiction it is. At the 1-year follow-up, 3 out of 4 subjects maintained sobriety. At the 3-year follow-up, most experimental subjects continued to maintain sobriety, while controls continued to revert to pretreatment status. Now here's the important conclusion by the authors. Since that time, a small number of addiction treatment programs have incorporated neurofeedback. The lack of more robust growth of the technology in addiction treatments is puzzling. Perhaps this is a result of lack of familiarity with neurofeedback within the addictions treatment community. If this is the result of ignorance, it's really a tragic ignorance, because this research has been out there now for 30 years. For 30 years, we've had substantial published research in journals showing that neurofeedback is many times more successful in treating alcoholics than any other treatment that we have. And yet, it's being used very little. And in fact, one of our local tragedies this year has been an edict coming down from the Division of Professional Licensing in which they have ordered licensed clinical social workers to cease and desist in their use of neurofeedback. And I looked into this. I started to investigate what is going on. Why are we ordering a cease and desist on our most effective addiction treatment of all time? What I found was that there have been no casualties. There have been no patient complaints. There have been no lawsuits. All that's happened is some other professionals have complained. Whether this is professional jealousy or what, I do not know. Other professionals have complained that LCSW's scope of practice did not include neurofeedback. Now, I've talked to some of the people who are doing this, and some of the very best neurofeedback labs that were treating addictions and veterans have been shut down as a result of this edict in Utah. And I have been assured that the licensed clinical social workers organizations are trying to go through all the necessary procedures, jump through all the hoops to get this approved as part of their scope of training. And I certainly hope that happens, because we have far too few neurofeedback practitioners, and getting neurofeedback training is very expensive, and the equipment costs about $10,000. So it's a huge investment for someone to go into this, and the training and the protocols are being updated every year, so people have to continue to do a couple $1,000s worth of training every year just to keep up with all the new advances in the technology. We need to be supporting our neurofeedback practitioners as much as possible, and we need to be expecting that really credible, serious addiction treatment centers are going to be using neurofeedback as a major part of their therapy. Not the only part, because neurofeedback has never been intended to be used as a standalone therapy. It needs to be used with group therapy and individual therapy that builds social skills and creates support with a network of individuals and teaches individuals the kinds of lifestyle changes they need to make. So it should not be used as a standalone therapy, but it definitely needs to be part of any serious addiction recovery program. It's just too valuable of a resource for us to ignore. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about addiction recovery, some of the process and some of the options, after we take a break for this next commercial. We'll be right back with Healing Talk Radio.
Hi, I'm Mary Louise Zeller. I'm an independent distributor with Kyani, and I've achieved in 3 years the rank of Blue Diamond. I'm here today to tell you about one of Kyani's 3 products. They have 3 products called the Triangle of Health. This product is Kyani Sunrise. It's a very, very powerful antioxidant based on superfruits. The first, most important one being the wild Alaskan blueberry that has 20 times the antioxidant value of the common blueberry, and that was ranked number 1 of all fruits and vegetables in its antioxidant power. In addition, we've got a rich array of many other superfruits. One of the ones I like is goji, which has 18 essential amino acids, also omega-3s and 6s. It's loaded with liquid vitamins and minerals, all of which are in a form that your body can use wholly. I think this is a leading-edge, best money can buy antioxidant product.
Psychology is changing rapidly. Most of what we've been taught in the last 30 years about mental health is now outdated. If you believe that senility is inherited, or depression is a chemical imbalance, or post-traumatic stress disorder is a life sentence, you're behind the current research. Too many of us have been getting our mental health education from the TV advertisements of pharmaceutical companies. And when that happens, we're missing out on the discoveries of today's neuroscience. There's incredible hope and healing for so many conditions that were once thought to be permanent, and most of these solutions do not require the long-term use of medication. I'm Diana Hoffman, owner of Light Spring Counseling. Call me for a free initial consultation at 801-735-7814. That's 801-735-7814, or go to lightspringcounseling.com. Discover the hope and power of the new psychology of healing.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pam Mays. I'm the host of Care of the Soul, and I will be with you broadcasting Thursdays from 1 to 2. I'm a psychologist. I'm a meditation teacher, author, playwright. I write under the nom de plume Pam Blackwell, and I'm interested in bringing to you psycho-spiritual aspects of the human being, like dreams, meditation, common psychological problems. I hold seminars and workshops on this topic in Utah County, and would love to have you join me for those. Please join us for Care of the Soul. Hi, I'm Dr.
Welcome back to Healing Talk Radio. This is your host, Diana Hoffman, and we're exploring the relationship between trauma and addictions. As we've indicated, trauma is the primary source of addictions. We see that in the fact that a person with 6 or more trauma categories has a 40-fold increase in their chances of becoming addicted to illegal injected drugs, and other similar statistics from the ACE studies. Now, I've just received a question from one of our listeners. This is from Scott in Idaho, and he's asking, how does this relate to video game addictions in children? And that is such an excellent question, because that kind of broadens this whole discussion into the realm of behavioral addictions. People are sometimes addicted to drugs that they take into their body, but they can also become addicted to their own neurotransmitters if they use to elevate those neurotransmitters in an unbalanced and an addictive way. And we see this with a lot of behavioral addictions. We see this with cutting and self-harming, in which people are deliberately pressing their brain to release endorphins. We see this with gambling. We see this with shopping and spending addictions, which also push the reward centers of the brain to produce endorphins. And we also see this with video gaming. And with video gaming, a lot of times what's happening is we're getting a dopamine as well as an endorphin reward based on stimulating a reward center of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And video gaming becomes excessive when a person doesn't have real-life ways of resolving their pain and their stress and their frustrations, and so they use video games as their primary way of getting to feeling good. Now, one of the big problems with this is, first of all, it disrupts people's lives because video gaming can take over all sorts of normal life functions. But second, this intensive stimulation of the nucleus accumbens in a situation where the body's doing almost nothing, like just thumbs are pushing a controller, this starts to create a disconnect between the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and this little reward center, the nucleus accumbens. And this disconnect looks on brain scans an awful lot like what you get with the cocaine addiction. And so the cutting off or the reducing of activity in the prefrontal cortex while the nucleus accumbens is being rewarded makes it so a person has less and less of a connect between their reward and the consequences or the real-life applications. And so the world kind of narrows and narrows and narrows. They become less and less aware of, less and less concerned with family interactions, school, sports teams, grades, their future. All of this matters less and less. The real world kind of disappears, and the consequences of this shrinking matter less and less. So kids care less and less about punishments. They care less and less about bad grades. They just don't care about consequences because they're having this disconnect between their reward centers and their prefrontal cortex. So it's a very insidious kind of addiction and a very troubling one. And as with any addictive or dangerous substances, there's an amazing amount of authors writing books like Everything That's Bad for You is Good for You, which means we can find logical rationales for you to do anything that you've been told is bad for you. Now, that's definitely true with video game addiction. So there's books out there that will tell you they're good for you, and they stimulate your brain in useful and in helpful ways. But whatever useful or helpful benefits are coming, they're really outweighed by this addictive effect, which is very damaging. So if we look at the process of healing and recovering from both addiction and from trauma, we're looking at a process where a person is going through stages, where the first thing they need to learn, and they can learn this with neurofeedback or perhaps with some other kinds of release training. Meditation is perhaps the only personal practice that's really good at creating the theta wave state, as effective as neurofeedback. But meditation takes a lot more discipline, and addicts are not so good at discipline. But whatever the resource that's being used, the first stage that happens is a person feels releases happening that carry all the way to completion, all the way to feeling good, and they discover that that painful event is now so neutralized that when they remember it and think about it, there is no pain attached to it. They can go back to a memory, they can go back to a trauma event, and it seems not to matter. It seems completely neutralized. Until this actually happens to a person, it's hard for them to believe it's possible. It's hard for them to believe that something that has been really devastating to them could ever be thought about, remembered, and reviewed with no emotion. But this is what happens when an emotional release is completed and when that neural networking fully happens. And so that's the first stage of recovery, is they get to this place of, that happened to me. I had something painful happen, and it does not hurt anymore at all. Now, for a lot of people, that's very liberating. For addicts, that's a long ways away from solving the problem because they're going to have to go through several more stages until they reach a level of every time their pain comes up, they know it's something they can release, and they have the skills to do that fairly easily. And as I've mentioned before, this is easier to do by training the subconscious using electroencephalograms and neurofeedback than it is behaviorally, but it can be done both ways. Either way, the important point is that a person can reach the point eventually in their healing process where all of the traumas of the past have been resolved. And all they have to do is live in the present and deal with the things that come at them one day at a time, and this seems very manageable. Now, you've been listening to Healing Talk Radio, and if any of you would like to watch this program or hear it again, it'll be posted. It'll be replayed several times each day for a week on Planetary Streams Talk Radio, Web Campus Worldwide Radio, and Shoutcast. It'll also be archived in a little while on my radio blog, which is healingtalkradio.com. And so you can go there and you can watch the videos streaming anytime, and you can also watch past programs. Again, that's healingtalkradio.com. I'm Diana Hoffman. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Utah County, and I will be here every week on Healing Talk Radio. Thank you for joining us.